In this lecture, we are going to start looking into broken function level authorization vulnerability, identify it in our code, and then fix it. So broken function level authorization is a security vulnerability in API applications where the authorization checks for a function or resource are not properly implemented or enforced. This means that the vulnerability allows attackers to access and exploit functionality that should be restricted based on user's role or permissions. So in very simple terms, you can think of this vulnerability where an endpoint which is serviced by a particular function in the backend is supposed to be accessed just by admins or administrators of the application, but because of the lack of proper authorization check, even normal users or attackers are able to access it. So how does broken function level authorization works? To exploit this vulnerability, the attacker sends a legitimate API calls to an API endpoint that they should not have access to as an anonymous user or regular non-privileged users. Now the authorization checks for a function or resource are usually managed via configuration or code level. Implementing proper checks can be confusing task since modern applications can contain many types of roles, groups, and complex user hierarchies. Attackers can discover and exploit these flaws in APIs by accessing unauthorized functionality. Administrative functions are particularly targeted as they may lead to data disclosure, data loss, or data corruption, and ultimately service disruption. Now let's look at two examples of broken function level authorization exploitation. So imagine an application has a registration process that allows only invited users to join. Now the mobile application triggers an API call to retrieve details about the invite. Now here an attacker duplicates this request by after capturing the original request in application and then manipulates the HTTP method and endpoint to access an administrative endpoint that should only be accessible by administrators. Now at this point, if attacker is able to figure this out, attacker can exploit the lack of function level authorization checks and gain admin privileges, then create an admin account and gain full access to the system. In another common scenario where an API contains an endpoint that should only be exposed to administrators, which returns detail of all users in the application, but because of the lack of function level authorization checks implemented on that function, an attacker guesses the endpoint URL and accesses it, exposing sensitive details of the application's users. Now in our sample application, we are going to look at some of the endpoints which are left vulnerable to this broken function level authorization exploitation. We are going to focus on delete and put APIs for book and author. Now ideally these should be only accessible to admin, but we'll see how lack of function level authorization check will let normal users access these API endpoints too. So in the next lecture, we'll go to our application and see these examples. Thank you.